In this video, we are going to have a look at the topic of preparing budgets. So first and foremost, let's have a think about why a business may actually want to create a budget. What is the purpose of them? Well, they aid with planning as well as any control and evaluation, and it can also act as a method of communication between people at the firm. It also means that any expenditure is technically having to get authorised in advance because we don't really want to exceed that budget if we can help it. It should also allow for coordination. So all management at the top should be in agreement with one another with regards to how much they have set aside to pay on a certain expense. It can also help with motivation. Essentially, managers want to stay within that line, so they are motivated to go out and source the cheapest items, get the better prices that they can. So obviously with everything, there are advantages and disadvantages for budgeting. So beginning with the advantages then, well, it ensures actions are matched with goals. It forces management to look into the future. What could possibly happen? Organisations are going to be much better placed in order to actually act and adapt to change if this happens. Management are also forced to consider how much added value does each product or service bring to the organisation. It may be a case that when the budget is drawn up, that they decide that some products or services need to be withdrawn because they simply aren't bringing enough money or enough value to the business. And budgeting can, of course, improve decision making on resources and cash allocation as well. Disadvantages then. Well, of course, budgeting is going to be time consuming to create. Whoever does it is going to require some time to do, especially if it is new to the organisation. It is going to be subjective when predicting future changes. You may have disagreements within the organisation about how much you can set aside for one expense, but there are also going to be external factors which you may not know about at the time of creating the budget, which is going to impact this. Conflict may also be created at this point. What we have to be careful with is that when we create a budget, it focuses solely on financial reward. It can also deter innovation and enterprise because we get so stuck down into how much we can actually afford to spend or what we think we can afford to spend instead of keeping up to date with the latest trends, which in turn can lead to the loss of a competitive advantage. So global companies then may sometimes face difficulties when it comes to budgeting. So one of the main examples of this is currency. It is very difficult in order to actually pinpoint what an exchange rate is going to be in the future. Today's exchange rate is going to be likely different to what it's going to be in 1 month's time. Likewise, the legality work and the paperwork behind it is probably going to vary from country to country. Customer tastes and competitor actions are going to vary all around the world. We can't just focus on one country or one destination that we sell or produce from. We must instead think about each one in turn. And of course, as with anything, the political climate is always going to play an impact upon this, and that's just something we need to be careful of when we are preparing a budget. So, what is a master budget then? Well, a master budget collates together all departmental or activity budgets for all departments or responsibility centres throughout an organisation. Another term you need to be familiar with is the budget period. So this is the time in which the budget is going to be prepared. It will be typically done on a year-end basis when the year-end financial statements have been done. It may also be done quarterly, monthly, weekly. It is whatever the business sets. It must not be too short though, because otherwise too much time is just going to be tied up in preparing that budget, whereby your workforce could be doing something more productive. Likewise, it must not be too long, because otherwise it's just going to become outdated, it's going to become irrelevant. What is a principal budget factor then? Well, it is essentially something when a key resource is in short supply, so think about our limiting factors. It is usually assumed that this factor is going to be our sales demand, and this should be the starting point for all of the budgets. How much are we likely to sell in the future? So when creating a budget then, there are some preparation steps that we need to follow. So step one is to do the sales budget. This essentially considers the number of units which are and which can be sold. It may be expressed in revenue terms as well as in units sold. It highly depends on how the business or organization want to lay this information out. It may combine the sales budgets of several sales regions as well. Again, it is up to the business whether they want to categorize it into separate regions or whether or not they want to actually just do the budget as a whole. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. Step two then is to calculate your production budget. So this considers how many units must be produced to meet the budgeted sales level. So if we are calculating it in units, we take our sales budget, add on any closing inventory finished goods, deduct any opening inventory finished goods, which would then give us our production budget. It is the direct opposite to our cost of goods sold figure. So be very careful that you do not mix the two calculations up. At this point, we can then add on any good fault-free production which has been required, and plus any faulty production wastage, which would then give us our total production figure. Step three then is our raw materials, labour and overhead budgets. So subsidiary budgets must be prepared for materials, labour and production overheads in order to express the budget under financial terms. Many managers from across the organisation may be involved in this process. So generally, raw materials are going to be calculated as they are in production, and then we do our materials purchase figure. So materials required in production plus our wastage will equal our total material requirement. We would then add on our closing inventory of raw materials and deduct our opening inventory of raw materials, which would then lead to our materials purchase budgeted figure. Continuing with step three then, but this time looking at direct labour. So if it is variable, it is going to be calculated as our production budget in units multiplied by our direct labour cost per unit. Idle time must be factored in. Do not forget about it. If your labour is going to be fixed, it can be calculated by estimating the payroll cost rather than doing the above calculation. Still on step three then, but this time focusing on our overhead budget. So if absorption costing is used, overheads are going to be allocated and apportioned using our budgeted overhead absorption rate. Remember, in order to calculate that, we take our budgeted overhead and divide that by our budgeted activity levels. Step four is all about the non-production budgets. So these are simply just costs such as selling and distribution. They aren't necessarily going to be involved in production directly, however, they must be considered. And then step 5, 6, and 7 is all about putting together your master budget from the steps that we have just calculated. So this is going to be summarised as a budgeted statement, profit or loss, cash budget, or statement of financial position. Some businesses will present each statement in turn. Remember that functional budgets should be revised until a satisfactory planned outcome is achieved. So cash budget and cash flow forecast then. What is a cash budget? Well, It is a vital planning document within an organisation, and it shows the expected cash inflows and outflows. It will help to identify any cash deficits or cash surpluses that the business may expect to rise in the next budget period. Because of that, management are able to plan ahead. And the accuracy of this budget is going to depend on the forecasts from which it is based. So when interpreting a cash budget, then there are many factors that need to be considered. So the first one, when is the best time to make any discretionary expenditure? What is the key causes of any cash deficits? Does the balance at the end of the period match with expectations? Are there sufficient finances available to cover any cash deficits that may arise? Should new sources of finance be placed or sourced as a what if situation arises? Should asset purchases be leased where possible instead of buying them outright? There is more factors that should be considered that I may not have listed here. However, they are questions that businesses should be asking themselves when it comes to preparing a budget. So the master budget then, it is essentially a summary of all functional budgets. It is submitted to senior management for approval. And is the budget an acceptable plan for the forthcoming period? Firstly, you should ask yourself that before submitting it for approval to senior management. But also, does senior management think it is acceptable? What is sensitivity analysis then? Well, this involves revising the budget based on a variety of assumptions. So one assumption will be changed at a time to determine the overall impact, and this will be done on a continuous basis to see what happens at each interval that a factor is changed. Obviously, for doing this, with the advancements in technology that we have, spreadsheets are going to be essential. They are going to save the business a heck of a lot of time if they use them rather than doing these calculations by hand. We then have stress testing budgeting. So this is a substantial examination of how a budget copes under pressure if difficult situations were to arise. So, for example, of unexpected pressure. So if we look back to COVID, nobody could have predicted that. You look around, everywhere shut down, businesses had to act differently. Many offices closed and staff had to find a new way of working. Work from home if you can, was the motto by our UK government. Businesses complied with that, but did that affect the budget? Probably so, because at the end of the day, yes, we may have gotten grants, or businesses may have gotten grants, but a lot of businesses may not have had the supplies, the equipment in order to be able to satisfy that need. So sources of business stress examples, cybersecurity attacks, they are happening more and more often as technology evolves. It could be a change in consumer demand. It may be industrial action or strikes, for example. The train drivers, the unions have been on strike multiple times over the past couple of years, causing people to be unable to travel. It could be to do with foreign exchange rates, or it may even be economic factors such as, are we about to go into a recession, or are we about to hit a boom? It might be that one of your major customers has decided to leave you, maybe through no fault of their own. Perhaps they've gone into liquidation. And technology advancements is a big one as well. So we obviously need some data to form a basis for our budget. So where do businesses get this information from? Well, they'll do their own market research, but they will also have their own historic sales trends that they can follow, as well as any general economic data available out there. It may be public announcements. It could even be a business unit consultation if they have had talks. Big data sources then are going to help form budgets in many cases. So for example, databases, the internet, social media, even the radio, television, artificial intelligence. Many of those are probably going to become outdated very soon, such as the radio. But at the moment, it's still a very valid source in order for companies to actually budget using big data. So what are the benefits of this then? Well, it drives innovation. It allows for improved productivity, as well as gaining a competitive advantage. Although there are some issues with using big data as well. So because the data is readily available, what's to say your competitors aren't already using it? You might have fallen short of that competitive advantage. You all know the internet perhaps isn't as reliable as what you might like it to be at times, so that data may be distorted slightly. And it also requires a significant investment in IT to actually store, organize, and manage the data. So it can run up big costs. There are, however, many approaches to budgeting, which we are going to have a look at them now. So a periodic budget then, well, this just shows the costs and revenues across one period of time. The first type of budget is a rolling budget. So with this type of budget, it is continuously being updated by adding a further accounting period once the earliest accounting period has expired. It is particularly beneficial where the future costs and/or activities cannot be forecasted accurately. So these should be used when accurate forecasts cannot be made, and if there is a particular area of the business which needs tight control. So what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? Well, the good thing about a rolling budget is that it is possible to be used for cash budgets. It reduces any levels of uncertainty because it is being continuously monitored and continuously updated, which in turn obviously means managers have to be on the ball, they have to play the right game, and they are constantly looking forward into the future. Disadvantages then. It can be sometimes difficult to communicate due to just such frequent budget changes. We all know how busy life gets. Perhaps you don't have time to discuss this. And it is, of course, very time consuming because you're having to update it continuously as opposed to just every period. That in mind then, let's take a look at incremental budgeting. So what is this? Well, it is the more traditional approach, and we use last year's budgeted figure and we add on a percentage allowing for this year's inflation and any other cost rises. So the advantages of this then, well, it's quick, it's easy to process. It's very, very simple to implement because all you're doing is taking last year's figure and adding on a set percentage. Plus it's low cost, there's not much work involved, making it very practical. However, it is going to assume that all activity level is going to be continued at operational levels. That's unlikely, especially with businesses that continue to grow year upon year. There's not a particular justification for each activity's change. So that may lead people within the organization to spend more than necessary on certain categories. So that needs to be considered. It might be that targets are likely to be unchallenging, leading to a demotivated workforce. And it can, of course, encourage overspending, like I've just previously mentioned. Next up, we have zero-based budgeting. So with this, all activities are going to be reevaluated each time that a budget is formulated. Each functional budget is going to assume that the function just does not exist and it sits at zero cost. It is essentially starting from the beginning. It is a much more radical alternative to incremental budgeting. So, Advantages and disadvantages of this then. Well, it places a greater emphasis on organisational goals. It's more accurate to that current time period. So that is, of course, a benefit. Because of that, it actually establishes a performance measure for each decision to be made and allows change to be accepted. Because of this, managers are forced to examine all activities. Managers are, of course, involved in this process as well. Disadvantages then, it is a time-consuming process because you are essentially starting from the beginning. It may become too rigid and the management team may not possess the necessary technical budgetary skills that would perhaps deem to be useful if using this type of budget approach. Activity-based budgeting then. This takes a very similar approach to that of activity-based costing. It is essentially based on an activity framework and utilising cost driver data in the budget setting and variance feedback processes. It is necessary to budget the costs for each cost pool or activity. So starting with the advantages then for activity-based budgeting, it recognises the activities which drive costs and it provides useful information for the total quality management system. It draws attention to the costs of overhead activities as well. Disadvantages: if we rely on the use of ABC as the standard costing system, what's to say that that is going to be accurate? What we've got is close to being accurate, but not necessarily. It's also going to be quite expensive to implement because you are having to do the activity-based approach. And finally, we are going to have a look at something called beyond budgeting. So first of all, what is it? Well, essentially, it tries to resolve any issues which arise with the traditional budgeting methods. So the official definition from CIMA themselves simply states it is an idea that companies need to move beyond budgeting because of the inherent flaws in budgeting, especially used to set contracts. It is argued that a range of techniques, such as rolling forecasts and market-related targets, can take the place of traditional budgeting. So, not all of them, but just a few common features of beyond budgeting is that it is a wider range of performance measures that are being used. So, for example, customer satisfaction. Targets are often going to be set based on benchmarks which have been observed externally, and it is also likely to encourage and reward innovation. So again, advantages and disadvantages of this. Well, it's quick. Managers are able to make quicker decisions with it, so that's a big benefit. Because of that, the organisation can potentially become more innovative and continuously strive to improve. Targets become more challenging, but more market-focused as well. It also creates an IT system which will provide a fast, open, and relevant information easily accessible for the business. Drawbacks of this then? Well, it's going to be a costly investment to implement. If benchmarks and targets are unrealistic, less effort is going to be taken by staff to actually achieve them. Staff may be resistant to the change, and essentially any planning, coordination and performance evaluation may become more complex with this as opposed to the other traditional methods of budgeting.